Heaven is home, for the praises of the Lord are going on.
Stand up on your feet. Come on.
Stand up on your feet and bless His name. He's worthy, He's worthy, He's worthy, He's worthy, He's worthy to be praised.
As I begin to think about what to preach today, I struggled all week trying to find something, trying to find a subject. What do you want me to say to the people? And then Friday, I got a text from Pastor Chris. He always sends out these morning meditations, and it had something about being tested. The fact that you have to be tested in order to go to the next level. Anybody that's attended any kind of education or any kind of schooling know that most times you can't graduate or you can't move to the next level without a test. And that's true even in our spiritual lives, that in order to go to the next level, God wants to test us. God has to ensure that we are ready for the next level. And then, of course, when I thought about testing, I thought about products being tested and materials being tested. And somehow I thought about some gold being tested. And it took me back to one of my favorite TV shows growing up. There was a TV show called The A-Team. And it had Face Man, it had Hannibal, it had Mad Dog, and my favorite was Mr. T. his name on the show was B.A. Baracus. And then Mr. T, I thought about Mr. T. What is he known for? He's known for his mohawk, and he's known for his jewelry. And most of the jewelry I would suspect is real, but in order to really know if his jewelry is real, to really know if it's authentic, to understand if it's really what it says it's going to be, it has to be tested. And I would say, okay, if it has to be tested, because you can have 10 karat gold, you can have 14 karat gold, you can have 18 karat gold, but really the manufacturer said the purest form of gold is 24 karat gold. And in order for that gold, it doesn't just come out the ground shining, it has to go through a process before it can get tested. It has to go through 7 steps. It has to be mined, then it has to be crushed, then it has to be concentrated, then it has to be smelted, then it has to be refined again, and then it has to be casted, and then it goes through quality control. So if gold must be refined, if gold must be tested, if gold has to go through a process, then what does that say about us? One, that there is a testing that we have to go through, and two, that there is a process that God is sending all of us through. So I want to talk to you today about 24 karat gold. And I get to talk about one of my favorite biblical figures by the name of Job. Job 23:10, even in the midst of his trials, even in the midst of his losing everything, even in the midst where nothing was going right for Job, he made this statement in Job 23:10. He says, "But he knoweth the way that I take. When he had tried me, I shall come forth as gold. He knoweth the way that I take." In other words, there was a path. Job knew that there was a path, and he knew that God knew where he was at. See, Job, if you read before, Job said, I looked to the left, I looked to the right, but God wasn't there. He said, the places that I usually find God, I couldn't find him. But then he said this, he says, God knoweth the way that I take. See, Job had lost God. Job couldn't find God. But the good news is, even though Job thought he had lost God, God had not lost him. And he says, he knoweth the way that I take. It is a blessing to know that God knows. It is a blessing to know that God has knowledge over all our situations. Everything we go through, God still knows. See, people can think, people can have an opinion, people can speculate, but God is the only one that knows. Because many times when we get into some issues, when we get into some trouble, we get into some hardships, the first thing people want to say, they want to start diagnosing, well, you reap what you sow. God don't like ugly. That's why you're going through what you're going through. But if we look at Job as an example, the Bible said Job was a perfect and upright man, and that Job avoided evil at all costs. Job's friends came and sat with him for 7 days without saying a word. And then when they started talking, they said, Job, you must be crazy. They said, there's no way you can be punished without sin being present. He said, you did something to deserve this. And if you read all the way to the end of Job, God told Job, your friends were wrong. And in order for them to get forgiven, you have to pray for them. See, they had all these theories and all this stuff while God was doing what he was doing, but God knew what he was doing. God knows, not only does God know our path, God knows us. Psalms 139, it says, God, oh Lord, thou hast searched me, thou hast known me. Thou knowest my down sitting, my uprising. Thou understandest my thought afar off. Thou compassest my path and my lying down, and art acquainted with all my ways. Many times when we go through something, we think that we are catching God off guard. We think that we are surprising God with our issues. And I'm here today to tell you that we cannot surprise God. We cannot catch God off guard with our problems, with our situations, with our circumstances. God already knows. Many times when we pray, we talk to God as if he is ignorant, as if God does not have knowledge of our situation. But the blessing is today, people, that God knows. And that's a blessing. But the bigger blessing is that even when we forget about God, God still remembers us. That sometimes when things are going to good for us, we really forget and we lose our fervor and we think we don't need God anymore. We get a little prosperity and we don't understand who God is, or we may forget, or we may place God on the back burner. But even when we forget about God, God does not forget about us. Sometimes we make a stray away from God. We start to follow our own path. But the blessing is that God never forgets about us. And then even in our darkest time, we still may think that God forgets about us. You're like, God, if you knew what was going on, I wouldn't be in this situation. God, if you loved me, I wouldn't going through this. God, if you really remembered me in these dark places, this wouldn't be happening. So I heard a story that happened hundreds of 100 years ago when the very dawn of electricity, and this was the pastor that went to a very rural church, and they were having service because electricity had just not many people in the town had electricity, and in fact the church only had one light for the whole church, and that light wasn't very stable. So the preacher, he's up there preaching his heart out, and the light starts flickering, and the preacher gets nervous, and the light keeps flickering. Then all of a sudden, the preacher, while he's preaching, the light goes out. The preacher is flustered, and he doesn't know what to do. And then all of a sudden, a deacon yelled out in the dark. He says, keep preaching, preacher, because we can see Jesus in the dark. And I'm telling that story to say that even in your darkest times, you got to learn to see Jesus in the dark. Even when you can't see a light at the end of the tunnel, you still got to understand that God is in control and he has his hands on you. Even if it's dark for you, it's not dark for God. You might not be able to see God, but the bigger and the most important thing is that God can still see you. Job says, you know the path that I take. And I began to think about all these GPS apps that we have. You may use Google Maps, you may use Apple Maps, and you may use Waze, but there's many maps that we can use in our life. And I thought about it. What happens in our life when we make a wrong turn? Or what happens when we go a way we shouldn't go? All the GPS, they'll give you a signal, and all they'll say is rerouting. They'll say rerouting. And I says, okay, they reroute us. That's fine. But I understand that even though they may reroute us, the destination never changes. They never change the destination, even though the route may change. And I'm here today to tell you that God is never changing your destination, even though your route may change. So even if I make a wrong turn, God does not throw me away. God does not say I'm done with him. He just reroutes me. The destination is still the same. And then sometimes they won't reroute you. Sometimes they'll say, go a little further and just make a U-turn. So even when I'm going the wrong direction, all God tells me is go turn around and go back to where you came from. You're going the wrong way and just turn around. Just simply make a U-turn. And sometimes we can apply that to our life. All we have to do, if we know we're going the wrong direction, just make a U-turn and go the other way. And then I heard, I believe it was Terry Anderson, he said this. He says, God's sovereignty is connected to my sanity. That means that's just preacher talk for saying that if God wasn't in control, I would go crazy. That if God still didn't have his hands on me, I would have lost my mind a long time ago. And I think we can all attest to that, that if it wasn't for God, many of us would be hugging ourselves in a mental institution. We could have given up long time ago, but God still has his hand on us, and we could live and see another day because God's sovereignty. We can know, no matter how bad life gets for all of us, God is still in control. We can go through our personal issues. We can go through some deep and dark crises, but knowing that God can still handle what I can't, that gives me hope. That gives me reason to go on, knowing that I don't have to fix something that I can't fix anyway. That God still has his hand on my situation. So Job says, he knoweth the way that I take. Then he says, when he had tried or when he had tested me, that means that there's a process. That there's a process. When he had tried, when he had tested me, he sent me through a process. And all a process is a series of, or steps of actions to achieve a specific goal or to produce a desired outcome. All of us have to go through a process. When we begin to go to the gym, you go to the gym, I don't care how hard you work out, you will not see results the first day. You probably won't see results the second day. You may not see results for a couple of weeks. But you keep going, because if you trust that process, if you keep going and adding those days on top of each other, eventually you will see the results. So when God is taking us through a process, you may not see what's happening the first day, you may not see what's happening the second day, but I'm telling you today to hold on to God, because at the end of the process, something will happen for you. We say, trust the process. Trust the process. It's almost beginning to be a cliche now about trusting the process. And I'm here to tell you, yes, trust the process, but you also have to trust God during the process. You have to trust God that whatever he sends you through, he knows what's best for you. You have to trust God even when you can't trace God. You have to trust God when you can't see God. And no matter what God sends you through, he's going to make you better for it in the end. And I began to think about Job and his process that he had to go through. He lost his family. He lost his wealth. He lost his health. He lost everything. Even his wife started talking crazy to him. So he lost everything. And that was painful. See, we think that the process is always going to be easy, but sometimes the process is painful, but you still have to go through the process. Sometimes when God sends you through things, it won't be nice, it won't be pretty, it won't be enjoyable, but the process is still worth it. And God is doing something to you in that process. And then like we get into factories, they test the product. Most times, I hope that we drive cars and we have things in our life that's already been tested. See, a manufacturer, they will test a product just so they can stand behind the quality of the product. They want to see that when I test this product, they want to see that can the product be trusted. But see, when God tests the product, he's not worried about can the product be trusted. He wants the product to trust him. See, God is not testing us to see if we can be trusted. God is testing us to see if we will trust him. if And then even when the product is tested, you test it for a substance. You test it for what is it really made out of. See, everything, you can go to any store and get something that looks like gold. It can be a reasonable facsimile. It could be a good counterfeit, but you can't tell real gold. You can't tell real diamonds until it's been tested. They have these things. I think it's called cubic zirconium, and it looks real to the uneducated eye. It looks just like a regular diamond. It seems to be a diamond. It appears to be a diamond. It feels like a diamond. But when you test it and see the substance, you'll find out that it's not really what it's made of. So many times we say we Christians, we say we love God, and then God will put us on a tester just to see if we are what we said we are. So sometimes God is testing our substance. It's easy to say that you trust God when your bank account is full. It's easy to say that you trust God when everything is going right, when your family's behaving right. But many times God will put us on a tester just to see if we are what we said we were. Can God trust you with trouble? See, Job knew that he was going through a process. Job knew better than we did. He says that this suffering is just seasonal. You won't be suffering for the rest of your life. That the thing you're going through now, Paul even calls it a light affliction. Paul talking about it just happens for a moment. If Job was Pentecostal, if Job was Baptist, he might have sung, I'm so glad that trouble don't last always. So whatever you're going through right now, whatever's happening in your life, one, that is part of the process, and two, that is just a season. Ecclesiastes, the 3rd chapter says, to everything there is a season. So if you're having a dark period in your life, if things are dry, if things don't seem to be going well, I want you to remember this, that is just a season. And then the last thing is that there is a product. Job says, he knoweth the way that I take. And when he had tested me, when he had tried me, then he gets to the product. He says, I shall come forth as pure gold. Job realized, he says, God, I don't know what you're doing. God, I don't understand what you're doing. And if we real, Job said, God, I don't like what you're doing. But he says, after all this happens, I will come forth as gold. And I was like, well, Job, why did you say I will come forth as gold? Why did you use gold? Why did you just say I'll be better than I was when I entered into it? I'll be like he says, but no, Job uses specifically that I will come forth as gold. I said, Job, you might be onto something because gold is valuable. The money that we use, the money that we spend, is really just paper and really just metal. It used to be backed by gold because gold is one of the most valuable elements, is one of the most valuable things that we could ever have. Even in Job's time, gold was valuable. Gold was a sign of riches. And Job says, God, I don't know what you're doing. God, I don't know why you're doing it. But God, when I'm finished with this, when you are finished with me, I will be more valuable than when I started out. So when you are going through something, when you're going through that process, God is not trying to punish you. God is not trying to destroy you. God is not trying to hurt you. All God is doing is making you valuable. See, if we understand that you can't have diamonds without a little pressure. You can't have diamonds unless they went through a process. You can't even have gold without going through a process. See, many things go through a process, but before they become valuable. You can't have wine until the grapes are crushed. So sometimes you got to be crushed. Sometimes you got to be pressed. Sometimes you got to be refined before you can be valuable. And God is pressing us. God is refining us. God is sending us through some things in our life just so he can add to our value. And gold has to be refined. Like you don't just get gold out of the ground and say, look, it's gold. Gold has to be put in fire. What does that fire do? That fire burns off some impurities that will decrease the value of that gold. So when God sends us through the fire, God is not trying to burn us up. God is not trying to hurt us. God is sending us through the fire to get rid of some impurities that we thought we didn't have or that we neglected to realize that we have. Some people think they come out of the earth shining. Some people think they come out of the womb shining. They don't have any imperfections, any impurities, but that's absolutely not true. Every child of God must go through a process to get rid of those impurities. Even Peter says, but the God of all grace, who hath called us into his eternal glory by Christ Jesus, after you have suffered the Lord. In other words, after you have went through a process, he said it will make you perfect or make you complete. It'll establish you, it'll strengthen, and then what it'll do? It'll settle you. It'll settle you. What does it mean to settle? Like if you go to buy you some cereal or buy you some chips, it may start off with a full bag, but after it's been jostled around, everything settles to the bottom. If you go to a foundation, they say let it settle. So sometimes God don't want you to be shaken by everything. He tries to settle you. And then one thing about pure gold, that's why 14 karat gold is worn the most, because it's not pure, because 24 karat gold is really soft. But God is telling us, I want you to be gold so I can mold you, so I can shape you, not into what everybody else wants you to be. I'm going to mold you and shape you into what I want you to be. And Job says, God, when you finish testing me, I will come forth as gold. Job made it about him and he made it about God. He didn't talk about his friends. He didn't talk about his haters. He didn't talk about anybody else. He didn't even talk about the devil, because Job didn't even know the devil exists. He says, God, after I go through this process, you taking care of me. God, I trust you during this process. I don't care what you're doing with everybody else. I don't care what everybody else says. But God, I trust you. And I'm going to come forth as something that's valuable. You don't learn to trust God in comfort. You don't learn to trust God in the good places. You learn to trust God when things are going bad. Many times you don't know if God can be a healer until you see somebody that's sick. Many times people can say, well, God is this, God is that. And he said, well, that's fine and good. But I think the most you learn about God is when you put yourself in a situation and God does it for you. Yeah, we can shout about God doing it for something else, but really it gets real when God does it for you. When you say God is a keeper, it becomes personal when God keeps you when you know nobody else could. It becomes personal when you know, when you get that report from the doctor said, nah, it ain't looking good. And God said, forget about what they said. I'm still in control. It becomes personal when everybody said there's no way out. And God said, don't listen to them. I got you. When you tell yourself, I need to give up, God, what's the use? And God still tells you, hold on, I'm still in control. If you stick with God, he will allow you to overcome what overwhelms you. There's an old Negro spiritual that says, we shall overcome. So I'm telling you today, I'm reminding you today that there's a path. God knows where you're going. God knows where you want to end up. There's a process. God is testing you. God is trying you. God is going to move you to another level. But then after that, the good news is there's a product. That after you go through doing all this, after you went through all that tough struggles, all you went through that suffering, that you'll come out more valuable and you'll come out better than when you went in. Amen. Give God a hand praise.